Hi there. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time it is. As always, happy whatever day it is. Welcome to Left Side of the Aisle, and me, Larry Erickson, your host, who for the next close to half hour is going to be rattling on about some things that I think are worthy of your attention. Comments, questions, reactions are always welcome. They can be sent to me directly. My personal email is whoviating, WHOVIATING at AOL.com. Or if you didn't catch that, go to my website. It's called Lotus Surviving a Dark Time. And the URL will be over here somewhere a couple of times during the show. And you can get the email address from there, or you can leave a comment there if you'd rather. If you do send me email, as always, just two requests. One is to be sure to include something in the subject line that makes it clear it's about the show, it's not spam. And two, be a little patient about getting an answer because I just stink at answering my email. But you will get an answer. All right, with that, we always like to start with some good news where we can, so we've got a little bit of good news here. It relates to North Carolina's notorious law that made it a crime for transgender people to not use the public facilities that accorded with the, I hope I'm saying this right, with the gender that is on their birth certificate. That is, if they use the facilities that they felt were right for them, and that was different from what was on their birth certificate, that was a crime in North Carolina. The same law also made it illegal or banned local communities, local cities and towns from passing their own laws to protect LGBTQ people against discrimination. Now, that law continues to produce reactions. There have been some rather harsh ones, including some companies that abandoned plans to locate or expand in North Carolina, and the decision of the NBA to pull the 2017 All-Star Game out of the state. And now, on September 12th, the NCAA declared that the law makes it hard to, and I'm quoting, promote an inclusive atmosphere for all college students, coaches, administrators, and fans, and so announced that it is pulling 7 championship games out of North Carolina, a decision that was quickly followed by the ACC saying it's pulling next season's neutral site tournament games from the state. Now, I said before on this topic that I feel badly for those who will lose income because of the decisions of the NBA, the NCAA, and those companies and so on. But the fact is that bigotry must be made to pay a price if it is going to be turned back, and this is part of the price that's going to have to be paid. So yes, the decision by the NCAA increasing pressure on the troglodytes of the North Carolina legislature to revoke this law, that increasing pressure, that's good news. By the way, North Carolina Republican Party spokesperson Kami Mueller said in response that the NCAA doesn't want to have separate locker rooms for men and women, and that it would have, quote, cheerleaders and football players share bathrooms, showers, and hotel rooms. The only good thing to come out of that tangle of hyperbolic transgender-phobic blather is that it shows the right wing knows it is losing this one. And that makes the good news even better. All right, speaking of good news in sports, I'm sure you know of the quiet protest undertaken by San Francisco 49ers quarterback Colin Kaepernick, who refuses to stand for the pregame playing of the national anthem. First he sat on the bench, now he kneels on one knee. Doing it, he said, to protest, quote, a country that oppresses black people and people of color, unquote. You also know, I expect, that the protest is spread with some other professional athletes joining in it, while there were other people who either condemned it or just disagreed with it. But what you may not have heard about is the wave of similar protests that took place on high school football fields across the country on September 10th. In some cases, it was just a couple of players who knelt during the anthem. In other cases, it was most of the team. In at least one case, it was the entire team plus their coach. Schools in Massachusetts, New Jersey, Maryland, Virginia, Ohio, Kentucky, Illinois, Nebraska, and I'm sure others I didn't hear about, saw students protesting against police brutality and racism by the quiet act of kneeling. And all I can say is, the kids are going to be all right. All right, I have three observations to make about the presidential election. Treasure them, they may be the only things I say about the election. One thing is that if the Democrats, and including Democratic Party voters, had done what they should have done, which was nominate Bernie Sanders, this election would be a runaway. It would be a rout. The only reason it's even anywhere near close is because of the baggage that Hillary Clinton carries with her, baggage that makes people genuinely distrust her. And I would say that in my judgment, while the extent of that of mistrust is not justified, the fact of it is. The second thing is that ever since it became undeniable that Bernie Sanders was mounting a major challenge to Clinton, the Democratic Party has wanted to turn him into Jesse Jackson, someone who made a commotion, stirred things up, got their moment of glory with a primetime speech at the convention, and then faded away. Unhappily, so far, they seem to be succeeding in that, as not only has he largely disappeared, except for the occasional hooray for Hillary appearance, but more importantly, his political revolution, this is actually more on him than on the party, but his political revolution is looking more and more like merely another incarnation of our goal is to elect more better Democrats, the same incantation we've been hearing at least since 1968, and look how far it's gotten us. But the third thing is the one I wanted to spend a couple of minutes on. At a fundraiser in New York City on September 9th, Hillary Clinton repeated her charge that many supporters of Donald the Rump fall into a basket of deplorables. In fact, she said half of his supporters fit the description of, quoting, racist, sexist, homophobic, xenophobic, Islamophobic, you name it. She got a lot of flack for that and backed off some, saying she regretted using the word half. But here's the thing. As someone pointed out, according to the polls, about 40% of Americans support the rump, which would mean, per Clinton, that about 20% of the U.S. electorate is racist, sexist, homophobic, xenophobic, and or Islamophobic. And you know what? I have no trouble with that idea. I have no problem with the notion that 20% of the American population fits into at least one of those categories. Consider just one of those terms. Just consider the term racism. By almost any standard you care to use, life expectancy, school discipline, mortgage rejection, wealth, income, unemployment, police force, access to health care or housing or education, whatever metric you care to use, outcomes for white Americans are better, sometimes substantially better, than those for black Americans. And yet, according to a recent study, white Americans believe that racism, bigotry against whites has been increasing ever since the 1960s, to the point where now bigotry against whites is a bigger problem than bigotry against blacks. The facts be damned, white Americans are saying, we are the real victims here. It's the same cry with the same roots as when the Tea Party was screeching about how we, that is, we white Americans, we white people, are going to take back our country. So, when we have a criminal justice system so rife with injustice and racial bias that even UN observers are moved to make comment on it, when we have a man who tried to set a Muslim woman's clothing on fire on New York City's Fifth Avenue on September 12th, just 2 days after another woman physically attacked 2 Muslim women in Brooklyn who were walking their babies in strollers, when we had the repeated stories of judges and police departments who refused to take rape seriously while right-wingers strive to destroy Planned Parenthood, and 56% of American men say that sexism is a thing of the past, when nearly half of Americans agree with the idea of banning all Muslims from entering the United States, then yes, absolutely, I have no problem with the notion that 20% of Americans are racist or sexist or homophobic or xenophobic or Islamophobic or even all 5. Hillary Clinton backed off that claim about half, and it's really unfortunate that she did, because she was speaking the truth. All right, next up, something lighter, a very quick RIP that actually isn't an RIP because nobody actually died, but it is the end of an era. Vin Scully has announced that the very last baseball game he will announce will be when the Dodgers are playing the Giants in San Francisco on October 2nd. Now, it was known he was going to retire this year, but with a couple of weeks left in the regular season, the Dodgers have a 4-game lead in the NL West. So people were wondering then if he might do playoff games, since the Dodgers obviously will be in the playoffs. And he decided, no, October 2nd is it. And so ends, or will then end, a 67-year career as a baseball announcer. Vin Scully has been announcing baseball for about as long as I have been alive. And I just wanted to note the end of that career because, you see, I can remember Vin, who then went by the name Vince Scully, doing radio play-by-play for the Brooklyn Dodgers in the mid-1950s. I can still, in my memory, hear him calling out names like Snyder and Hodges, Furlow and Campabella. I can still hear him calling home runs with "she's away out there, she's gone." I could still remember how he used to love situations like 2 on, 2 out, and a 2-2 count because it gave him an excuse to say deuces are wild. Vin Scully was a part of my childhood and my adulthood. So hey Vin, thanks for the memories. All right, last up before we go to break. This is one of our frequent features. This is the Outrage of the Week. It's about a case where a cop was actually fired after a deadly encounter with someone with a gun. The thing is, the cop, whose name is Stephen Mader of the Weirton, West Virginia Police Force, he wasn't fired for shooting someone. He wasn't even fired for shooting someone who was unarmed. He was fired, stay with me here, for not shooting someone. Mader had responded to a domestic incident call and found himself confronting with a man with a gun. Nader said that his training to look at the whole person kicked in. He noted the man, whose name was Ronald Williams, had his gun in his right hand, but his arm was hanging loosely at his side and the gun was pointed down at the ground. When Mader tried to encourage, not demand or order, but encourage Williams to drop the gun, Williams responded with, "Just shoot me." Mader realized this is suicide by cop. He assured Williams he would not fire. Williams started flicking his wrists, trying to provoke Mader to shoot him, but Mader was sure that he could de-escalate this situation. Unfortunately, at that moment, 2 other cops arrived. Williams started waving the gun toward him, and they shot him and killed him. Williams' gun, not surprisingly, proved to be unloaded. Now, neither an investigation nor Mader faulted those other cops. They saw a man waving a gun and had neither seen nor heard what Mader had. But while Mader did not fault the cops, that didn't mean the department couldn't fault him. He was fired for having failed to remove a threat and putting the other cops in danger, even though, by the way, remember, this was done after they had already determined there wasn't a threat since the gun was unloaded. This is insane. Mader acted the way we want cops to act. He sized up the situation. He stayed calm. He tried to de-escalate. He didn't reach for his gun when he was not in danger, and he didn't kill somebody as his first line of defense. And the result is, he was fired. He's now studying to be a commercial truck driver, while across the country, repeatedly, cops who do get fired when they do something so bad it can't be dismissed or ignored just wind up being a cop somewhere else. And then we wonder why police brutality continues to happen. It's an outrage. And we're taking a break. And we're back. And yeah, so it's been 15 years. We remember 9/11, oh yes we do, and there are a good number of pundits and officials who will remind us in case we don't. And amid the pundits and officials symbolically patting the nation on the back for how supposedly brave and resilient we are, even as we have been by those very same voices conditioned like one of Pavlov's dogs to twitch with fear at the sound of the word Islamic, during that time comes the news that over the Labor Day weekend, one of the legacies of 9/11 was on full display. Over those 3 days, the U.S. military bombed 6 different countries spanning Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. It included 45 bombing raids in Iraq and Syria, and 20 targets in the Libyan city of Sirte, plus attacks on Yemen, Somalia, and Afghanistan. All they needed was to hit someplace in Pakistan to have run the entire course of nations that we have been bombing over the past few years. What George Bush pronounced an extended campaign against terrorism, has become what it had to become, what it could not fail to become, an extended campaign of unending war, a campaign now spread to multiple nations. It is one of our legacies of 9/11. Oh, but the spreading war is, officials insist, it's all necessary due to the endurance and geographic spread of Al-Qaeda and its various mutations, including Daesh or ISIS. Paul Scharr, a former Army Ranger and Pentagon official who's now at the Center for New American Security, claims that the Obama administration really wanted to end those wars, but instead has combat operations on multiple fronts. He then added, in the most unintentionally telling remark you will hear anywhere this week, "That's just the unfortunate reality of the terrorism threat today." Because indeed, that's what we're supposed to accept. That's just the way it is. Our wars are an unfortunate reality. It's all passive voice. The wars, or rather their causes, their roots, have nothing to do with us. They have nothing to do with anything we did or didn't do. Nothing to do with the invasions of Iraq or Afghanistan. Nothing to do with the drone bombings of Pakistan. We're merely helpless victims, almost passive observers, just doing what's necessary, never initiating anything, just responding always to others with actions that have no repercussions themselves. Because our actions have no repercussions. They have no blowback. They have no unintended consequences. It's all just an unfortunate reality. Just a couple of weeks after 9/11, I wrote something about that event that began this way. I'm quoting myself here. If the history of the Middle East over the last 30 years, and remember we're talking about the 30 years prior to 2001, if the history of the Middle East over the last 30 years proves nothing else, it proves beyond question that neither terrorism nor counter-terrorism, neither retaliation nor counter-retaliation nor counter-counter-retaliation will stop the circle of death. Particularly not so long as those on each side insist on seeing themselves as the wrong innocents, only defending themselves against unreasoning violence or oppression or exploitation or all three, while viewing their adversaries as evil brutes fully aware of their own brutality. Another cycle of mayhem is simply not an answer. And yet, more cycles of mayhem is exactly what we have seen in the years since. More counter retaliation is exactly what we've seen, and there's no sign of it ending. In fact, Scharr said that U.S. bombing campaigns are an appropriate response because they can be maintained and sustained over time in the same way that the U.S. is committed to long-term military presence in places like Germany and South Korea. That is, decades of bombing cities and towns is the same as troop presence by mutually agreed treaty in places not now at war. That same piece I wrote about 9/11, the same piece I wrote that I just quoted from, it ended this way. Our best targets for attack in this extended campaign are not the actual terrorists, who likely number no more than a few thousand, but the tens of thousands, the millions, from who they recruit and from who they draw their strength. Our best weapons are bread and butter, not bombs. Our best tactic, reconstruction, not retaliation. Our best strategy, justice, not jingoism. The best way to minimize terrorism is to ensure that the dispossessed have a genuine stake in the world and don't see us as grasping bullies. And the best way not to be seen as a grasping bully is not to be one. Now, I'll let you decide how well what I wrote 15 years ago has stood up to time and events, but the truth remains that unending war is one of our legacies of 9/11, a legacy that has, in point of fact, made the world less safe than it was 15 years ago. And that's one legacy, but it's not the only one. It's not the only one, because we also celebrated the anniversary of 9/11 by seeing Jed Johnson, who was the Secretary of the Department for the Protection of the Fatherland, We saw Johnson going around on the national media circuit pushing the latest version of Be Afraid, Be Very Afraid. This version being the dark, looming specter of self-radicalized actors in the United States, a specter requiring what one outlet called a modern-day version of Cold War-era ideological screening. Apparently the chain of ISIS is coming, no longer has the impact it once did, and some sort of reboot was required. Just how far did Johnson go in his spinning his around-the-campfire tales of dark and evil doings? He asserted that, and I'm quoting him here, in the current environment where we have to deal with the prospect of a lone wolf actor or a self-radicalized actor, just saying there's no specific credible threat doesn't tell the whole story. So in other words, even though there is no evidence of a threat, we have to act like there's evidence of a threat. That's the attitude we have adopted since 9/11. This is what the official notion of defending our rights, that is the notion of what officialdom has adopted as to what constitutes defending our rights. That's what this has come to. Deliberately promoted constant fear, even in the absence of evidence of a threat. So much so, in fact, that earlier this year, the FBI told high schools across the country to report to the government students who criticize government policies or Western corruption, or who say they're anarchists on the grounds that they are potential future terrorists. Schools also had it suggested to them that young people who are poor, who are immigrants, or who travel to suspicious countries are more likely to become terrorists. In fact, the feds claim that young people possess inherent risk factors that make them more likely to become terrorists, risk factors so broadly and vaguely defined that almost any high school student in the country could be deemed worthy of government surveillance. That is another legacy of 9/11. And then there are the laws that are enabled by that reign of fear and suspicion. The first and best known being the so-called Patriot Act, or as I always called it, the Traitor Act, for its impact on civil liberties and privacy, for its dramatic expansion of the ability of the spooks to poke, prod, pry, and probe into every aspect of our lives. In the wake of its passage, I noted that no one had been able to come up with a single argument as to how, if the law's provision had been in place, it would have stopped, prevented 9/11. Because there weren't any such arguments, and in fact the failure over 9/11 was not in not having authority, it was not using the authority that already existed. So at the time, I wrote that as part of a letter, adding more such powers, more authority to invade our privacy, restrict our freedoms, track our movements, more ability to substitute suspicion for proof, all while reducing judicial oversight, only creates more opportunities for official abuse. And of course, abuse is what followed. It's been out of the news of late, so I have to ask, have we forgotten what Edward Snowden revealed? Have we forgotten about the collection of phone metadata of every call within, into, or out of the United States? Have we forgotten the PRISM program, under which essentially all internet traffic that passed through the U.S. passed through the NSA? Have we forgotten about that agency's programs to have the ability to hack into any computer system it wanted to, individual, corporate, or government, friend or foe, anywhere in the world, no matter how well protected or encoded? Oh, right, yes, I remember. The USA Freedom Act last year supposedly took care of all that, except it didn't. But the only thing it did was end the bulk collection of phone metadata by the NSA under Section 215 of the Traitor Act, while at the same time requiring that phone companies keep that data so the spooks could try to get a court order to see it. And in essence, the only thing that's changed is who was holding the data. Meanwhile, this same law, the USA Freedom Act, did nothing about Section 702 of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. That's the provision of law that the spooks use to justify sweeping up as much of the internet as they can get their hands on. And it wasn't even relevant to Executive Order 12333, or 12333 as I understand it's known. It was a presidential directive dating from 1981 that defines U.S. spy operations. It allows the NSA to capture and retain essentially any data it can find, including the content of email, phone calls, and whatever else, required only that the information was gathered outside the United States. but in a technologically interconnected world, unlike anything that existed at the time that this executive order was issued, a world where an email from New York to New Jersey is as likely as anything else to wind up in a server in maybe Brazil or Japan or the United Kingdom, the restriction on outside the U.S. is utterly without effect. The only requirement is that the information be gathered in the course of a lawful foreign intelligence investigation, and even if the information is incidental, that is, it supposedly has nothing to do with the person or group that's supposed to be the actual target of the investigation, this executive order specifically allows the NSA to keep that data. No warrant is required, no court approval is required, no such collection need be reported to Congress, and even the people whose data was incidentally swept up don't ever need to be told. All of which means that the spook slogan has effectively become, all your data are belonging to us. That too is a legacy of 9/11. And finally, let's not forget that even as the government has claimed the authority to strip away all of our privacy, all of our secrets in pursuit of the chimera of national security, that despite a few victories, the government's own secrets are being held more tightly than ever. To the point where in April, just this past April, Congress was still trying to find out from James Clapper, who's the director of National Intelligence, just how many U.S. citizens had their personal information incidentally swept up into the NSA's databanks. And the fact is, during the Obama administration, there have been 8 prosecutions of whistleblowers under the 1917 Espionage Act, more than double the number of all previous presidents combined. And when you are prosecuted under the Espionage Act, you're legally barred from arguing your defense that material should not have been classified or that this actually benefited the public. In fact, you're barred from testifying about anything except did I or didn't I do this. So what is our legacy of 9/11? We as a people let one terrible tragedy, one serious attack, one bloody assault stampede us into a war in Afghanistan, which has killed over 100,000 people, and nearly 15 years later continues seemingly without end. Stampede us into a war in Iraq, which has killed hundreds of thousands, opened a door to Al-Qaeda and its demon spawn, ISIS, and has morphed into a war in Iraq and Syria with hundreds of thousands more people dead. To stampede us into actually seriously arguing about whether or not torture and other war crimes are okay if we do them. To stampede us into living in a constant undercurrent of promoted fear, to stampede us into surrendering our privacy, our civil liberties, and our ability to know what is being done supposedly on our behalf by a government that increasingly is now the tool of the intelligence community rather than the other way around. To stampede us into passively allowing the government to decide what we know, how much of it we know, and when we know it. Stampede us, that is, into heading down a slippery slope at the bottom of which is the loss of what it means to be a free people. That is our legacy of 9/11. It is a legacy that we need to reject clearly and strongly. That's it for this week. Next week we'll have some announcements about the show itself, but I'll just leave all that aside for now. We'll get to that next week. So for the moment, you just have the best week that you possibly can. And as always, I bid you peace.